Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and today we're going to take a look at the Dunu Zen. If you missed my unboxing a couple of weeks ago, I'll tell you a little bit about this thing. So this is Dunu's latest IEM at $700, not cheap, but it is a single dynamic driver earphone. And what's kind of a big deal about this is how big that dynamic driver is in here, right? So for comparison, something like the ThieAudio FH3 has a pretty nice large size 10mm dynamic driver in it. This is a 13.5mm dynamic driver, and there's even more to the size of this thing. Like if you look into the schematics and how it's built, like the diaphragm is larger than normal. I don't really care that much about it, but it's interesting. And you know, Dunu is kind of positioning this as sort of a sibling to the Dunu SA6 that came out, you know, a few months ago, and I reviewed that. I like that one quite a bit, but that's an all-balanced armature set, and I was curious to see how Dunu would do with a dynamic driver. So yeah, I've been spending a couple of weeks living with this IEM and comparing it to the SA6, also comparing it to my Moondrop S8, as well as the ThieAudio Monarch and some other IEMs. Frankly, just, I don't know, I've been listening to this thing actually quite a bit. So in this review, we're going to start by talking about the build and the physical aspects of it, then we'll talk about the sound, and eventually I will give you my conclusion on this IEM. And like my other reviews, this is a live review, so if you have any questions about it that I don't get to, leave those questions in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have a little conversation and hopefully answer your questions. And if you're watching right now and it's not live, you missed out, I'm sorry, but just subscribe to the channel, ding the bell. YouTube will let you know next time I'm live, and then hopefully we can have a little conversation. But for now, let's start by talking about the Dunu Zen. Ooh, you know what? Let's get a little bit more light on this bad boy, if my light will work. All right, let's start by just talking about the things that are inside the box, which is what I have displayed over here. The high res pin over here, not inside the box, but you can get that via a link in the description down below. But these things, however, are in the box. So you get an airline adapter. That's not that useful for me, but maybe some folks will care. You do get a 2.5 to 6.3mm adapter, as well as you get these connectors, which we'll dive into a little bit more when we talk about this cable that Dunu comes with. And then Dunu also supplies 4 different types of tips, which is actually kind of cool. I don't know, frankly, what the difference is going to be between them besides just your personal fit preferences. I can say that I started with these tips just because they seem the most unique. They're a little bit thicker than your average tips, but I don't know. I ended up going back to just my Sedna, my Asla Sedna lights, just because I like the texture of these things a little bit better. Just kind of like, this is not a Dunu specific thing, but folks out there, if you're making IEM tips, my recommendation is find out what Final is doing with their rubber, because Final tips just have the absolute best feel. These things, I thought they would be a little bit better, and they're maybe a little bit better than average, but I don't know, they just kind of lost their grip. And these ones maybe are a little bit more common, and these ones maybe are a little bit grippier, but they're a little bit on the narrow bore side. So what I would love to see, Dunu or anybody else, is a whitish bore tip like this with Final's rubber technology. All right, that's enough about rubber. They also come with this case. This is the same case that came with the Dunu SA3 and the SA6. And among IEM cases, this is actually one of my favorites. It's just, I don't know, it's simple and handsome looking. It's got a full zip, but then it's also got this webbing that kind of, you know, keeps it open to this like 60-degree angle. And I don't know why I like that. It just feels a little bit nicer than your average IEM case. All right, let's now talk about the build of this bad boy. All right, the cable that the Dunu comes with is, as far as I can tell, the exact cable that comes on the SA6, which, if you remember my review from there, I quite like this cable. It's a little bit on the thick side, a little bit on the, it's a little bit stiffer than average, I suppose you could say, but frankly, this is probably my favorite cable that's ever come packed in with an IEM. I just really like it. Like, it doesn't hold memory. It is a little bit on the stiff side, but it feels good. It feels chunky, and with the weight of the Dunu Zen IEM, I actually like that chunkiness to it. It packs up away well. Let's go ahead and do a little quick coil test so you can see how it looks like that. And just generally, it's a well done cable in terms of behavior. The other thing that's pretty standout about this cable is, of course, Dunu's interconnects, or these little connect systems. So you can pop this thing off and easily swap to one of these connectors. So if you wanted a 4.4 millimeter cable, you can go with that, or a 2.5 millimeter cable. These are both balanced connectors. You can go with that, or if you are a 3.5 millimeter basic like I am, you can always go with that. Maybe one of these days I'll do a rant about balance, but I'm just definitely I prefer 3.5 millimeter connectors. But then I guess let's go ahead and talk about the IEMs themselves and the build of these things. There's a couple of things that are pretty standout. So one, I mean, I think it's just a very handsome IEM. It's simple, it's understated, but I think it's really pretty exceptionally handsome. It's got this coating on it. I don't know if it's like a ceramic or a metal or what's going on here, but it does seem to be decently durable, because I'll be honest, I actually dropped these things a couple of times because they are so heavy. When I put these things on my nightstand, and actually because the cable is so heavy, there are a number of times I put this on my nightstand in the middle of the night, and either the cable or the weight of these things just kind of like threw themselves off the nightstand. It was inadvertently, I guess, a good test of the durability of the finish, because I have no cracks or dings or anything in the finish, so good job there, Dunu. But yeah, they are just, you know, they're handsome. They're relatively small, and I'll show you what they look like in my ear in a bit. Nice and round, no especially sharp edges, although here you could say that's a little bit on the sharp side. I don't think I had any issues with that touching my ear, so no complaints there. But one thing that's kind of curious about these things, and you might be telling this, look at this. These things are magnetic. So, I mean, all speakers have some sort of magnets in them, but the magnets that they've used here in the Zen are especially strong. And it actually comes into play when I'm just handling these things. Like, I've never felt the magnets inside of an IEM before, but here in the Zen, you definitely will. It doesn't make a big difference, I don't think, but it's an interesting thing to note. So now let's do a quick fit test, and I'll talk about the comfort. I mean, I'll start off by just saying the isolation on these things is maybe slightly below average. It's not great, but it's also not bad. For me, I mention this almost every time. Isolation in an IEM is not a big priority for me, but if you need isolation, there you go. Give you a little close-up view of the Zen inside my ear. But yeah, it's generally, it's a perfectly comfortable IEM. I was able to sleep through multiple nights with this thing in my ear, and yeah, it's not the most secure fitting IEM, so something like the SA6, where it's molded, is definitely gonna fit more secure and kind of just stay locked in, and you're not gonna have to worry about it. The Dunu Zen, kind of like a lot of other IEMs of this shape, I found myself having to sort of reseat them, every 30 minutes or so. Not so bad, and I did find that necessity of reseating them was reduced when I switched over to the Sedna light tips. But just a thing to keep in mind. And I think that's pretty much as I can say about the physical aspects of the Zen. If you've got any questions about it, feel free to hit me up in the live chat. But for now, let's go ahead and dive into the sound specifics. And like I typically do, I'm going to start just by giving you a general overall sound signature sort of description, and then we'll dive into a little bit more specifics. So the general sound signature of the Zen is not a neutral IEM. Unlike the Dunu SA6, which we'll get into that comparison in a little bit more detail later, the Zen is definitely not going for a neutral tone. That said, like, it doesn't sound like unnatural or anything like that. I would just describe this as kind of like a somewhat typical upper mid-range bass boost quasi V. I know a lot of the times a V sound signature, people assume it's like a treble. It's a bunch of treble and a bunch of bass, and the mid-range is recessed. And for me, this is just kind of like shifted a little bit, where the bass is now it's fairly sub-bass focused, but that rise is more in the upper mid-range, and then the lower mid-range, or maybe the mid-range, gets a little bit, I guess you could call it recessed, but it's just a little bit sucked out. Doesn't have a ton of body in that lower mid-range because of that. I think, you know, another IEM that I reviewed recently was the FIO, whichever way you want to say it, the FD5, also a single dynamic driver earphone. I think that also a V-shaped tune. This to me is a more natural tune. The Zen is. I think it does the V-shaped tone better. And that's just probably because it's more focused in the upper mid-range and less so in the treble. And about that treble, you know, this IEM is a little bit notorious for the way that it graphs in a frequency response, and if you want to see what the frequency response of this thing looks like, check out my unboxing video. I'm trying not to spend too much time with graphs in my reviews, just because I want the reviews to be a little bit more focused on my personal interpretation of the sound and less on the objective measurement. But a thing that stands out when you look at frequency response graphs of this IEM is that the treble rolls off quite a bit. And I gotta say that is, I think, a useful understanding of the way that this thing sounds. I think this is relatively V-shaped in sort of that upper mid-range lift, sub-bass boost, and then a little bit dark in the treble, a little bit rolled off. And when I say a little bit, maybe I'm understating it a little bit. I think this is kind of a dark sounding IEM, apart from sort of a mid-treble, a slight mid-treble emphasis. So let's talk about that treble, which I think is going to be one of the most controversial parts of the Dunu Zen. I think because of that relatively dark treble and because of that somewhat sucked out mid-range, in my opinion, the Dunu Zen just doesn't really present as a very detailed IEM. I think, you know, it's decently detailed. And if you're comparing it to other things that, you know, cost half as much or a third as much, it's not going to stand out as an undetailed IEM. But when comparing this thing to some other high-end stuff like the Moondrop S8, I think the resolution of the Dunu Zen just is fairly clearly behind, in my opinion, especially in that mid-range and in that treble. I did mention that sort of mid-treble emphasis, which can give these things a little bit of a sharpness to them, but mostly I think that, you know, if you're sensitive to treble, you're not going to have any issues with this because just generally it's a little bit dark in the treble. And that is actually, I don't know if I want to call this a plus, maybe an unintended side effect of the dark treble is that this album, if you've ever listened to London Grammar's, I actually don't even know, what is the name of this album? I don't even know the name of this album. If you've ever listened to this album by London Grammar, this album has some fantastic songs on it, but unfortunately, like, just constantly throughout the production, it clips, and it makes this very audible, sort of high-frequency static sound. Interestingly, the Dunu Zen kind of plays those clipping moments down to the point that I barely notice them. I'm not saying like you don't hear them, you can definitely still hear them. But on a lot of other IEMs, frankly, this album is just really annoying to listen to despite how good the songs are. And the Dunu Zen kind of saves them, which it's kind of a backhanded compliment, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, I will say that despite the fact that the treble on this is fairly controversial, I actually really did quite enjoy listening to the Dunu Zen, and it wasn't just because it saved that London Grammar album. I think it's worth talking about what this thing does really, really well, and I put it in the title of this video. This is a word I don't typically use with a lot of IEMs, and maybe it's just because most IEMs don't do this, or maybe it's just not a term that's typically in my vocabulary. It doesn't stand out, but for me, the Dunu Zen slams, which is to say that it's just a very physical sounding IEM. When bass hits, like very, you know, percussive hits, they just have this like sharp physicality to them that most other IEMs don't. And it makes this, in my opinion, one of the more entertaining IEMs to listen to that I've got. Now, again, this is not a neutral tune IEM. This is not the most technical in terms of resolving ability, at least in my opinion. But that physical character of this sound and just, you know, the tune, again, it's not my favorite tune because it is a little bit on the warm, thick side versus the mid-rangey side, but it's definitely not offensive. And with that slam and that physical character of the Zen, I actually found myself really quite liking it. I'm looking over my notes to see anything else. I mean, we can talk about imaging and Soundstage. I don't think are especially strong on the Dunu Zen. I mean, it does, you know, sort of that 3D effect and layering and depth to sound fairly well. I would say it's about average, not standout, but not bad either. This is more three-dimensional to me than something like the SA6, honestly. But I don't think you would get this for the staging and the imaging. I think what you would get this for is that physicality to the sound. That, you know, maybe it's not gonna work well with all music, but if you've got, you know, live productions and stuff like that, or just anything with nice, you know, with drums and really sharp percussion, it's gonna sound great, I think, on the Dunu Zen, provided nothing falls into that sort of mid-treble spike that could be an issue for some. All right, let's talk about a little bit of comparisons. And I've already mentioned the SA6, which is over here. This is, like I suggested, this is Dunu's sort of sibling to the Dunu Zen. But this is an all balanced armature set, and this is different not just in the fact that it's balanced armatures. I think that the target for this IM is very different. So this is not a neutral IM. I would call the Dunu Zen, or the Dunu SA6 a fairly neutral IM. It's got some sub-bass focus or some sub-bass emphasis, but primarily this is very neutral. So this has got a really clean mid-range, a lot of detail in the mid-range, really great treble. And I think just in terms of tuning, my preference is definitely for the SA6. I think, well, I don't normally talk about fit when I talk about these comparisons, but the fit of the SA6 is also just standout and I think worth calling out in this comparison. So a lot to like about this IM, and it's even a little bit cheaper. So $550 versus $700. So in some ways, I like the SA6 more, but it definitely lacks that physical character of the Dunu Zen. And it's partially because there's no dynamic driver in this, but I do also, you know, I think some other IMs that are all balanced armatures, I think still do that physicality a little bit better than the SA6. And then I don't have it on hand, but I did want to compare this a little bit to the ThieAudio FD5, just because it's also a single dynamic driver. I mentioned that I thought that the tuning here was a better balance, and just generally the Zen is to me what I was kind of hoping the FD5 to be. The FD5 is just a little bit too hot in the treble, especially that lower treble. It's a little bit, it's very fatiguing IM, frankly. And the tonality of the FD5, I think starts to take on a bit of an artificial flavor to it, whereas the Dunu Zen, while not being a mid-range specialist, I think it still does the mid-range tonality. It feels more natural. Yeah, just a better balanced sound, and then the physical character of the Zen is still quite standout there. The Moondrop S8, which I could pull up close by, but it's a little bit far out of reach, so I won't. Just use your imagination. The S8 I still like quite a bit better than either the SA6 or the Dunu Zen. I think the S8 is just the mid-range resolution and treble quality in that IM is standout fantastic. The staging, imaging, in my opinion, a pretty clear step above the Dunu Zen, but what the S8 misses out on is that bass physicality. I don't think the bass on the S8 is bad, but if you're looking for a bass, like an IM with solid bass, I wouldn't pick that as like, I wouldn't recommend that to you. If you're looking for a bass or an IM with solid bass, the Dunu Zen is frankly one I would probably refer you to. So that is gonna be my review of the Dunu Zen. And out of 5 stars, I'm gonna go ahead and give this IM a solid 4 stars. It's not my favorite tuning, and that treble, it could be a bit of a deal killer for a lot of people, but I think this thing does something that my other IMs don't. It's got that physical, it's got that like gorilla strength in it or something like that, that just makes it really satisfying to listen to in a different way than my other IMs. And on the plus side, again, this might be a backhanded compliment, but on the plus side, it makes that London Grammar album very, very listenable. So that is the Dunu Zen. If you're interested in checking this thing out, of course, I got a link in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, if you liked it, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already, ding the bell, and then I'll see you on the next super review. All right, live stream folk. Sean, yeah, Gorilla Strength. I don't know if I should have done that, but Gorilla Strength I think is it's got like that this presence about it that's almost intimidating. That's an overstatement, but it's got like a presence to it that your average IMs don't. All right, let me catch up with the live chat real quick. My Life Matter. Wow, I got a notification. That's great. Yeah, I don't know what YouTube's deal is with the notifications. I know there's multiple settings. When you ding a bell for a channel, you can say like sometimes or always, and maybe that's the difference, but I get a lot of people tell me that they don't get notifications, and it could just be a YouTube thing. Don Trumpion, what's up? My Life Matters saying Dunu makes all the accessories themselves. Hey, Dunu, if you make these tips, please make a tip like this. Maybe make a tip like the Sednas, but make it with the same silicone that Final uses, because they use the absolute best silicone. I think this tip right here is pretty close to the grippiness of it. That's a little bit on the thin side, and this is a narrow bore, so I didn't end up using that myself. But someone out there has got to do it. Final's not doing it. Someone's got to do it. Make a wide bore Final tip. Read code Zen Zen Zen. Best accessories and package Trumpion. Axel Deeker saying my Tin T2 Plus just died. Gotta love them MMCX connectors. Yeah, that is bummer to hear. Although, in my experience, I haven't had issues with MMCX connectors. Maybe that is worth calling out with the Dunu Zen. It is also an MMCX connector. Let's see if I can get this thing off. There you go. I personally don't have any issues with MMCX versus 2-pin. If I had to pick, I might pick 2-pin just because it seems like it's more common at this point. I have more 2-pin IEMs. But yeah, I haven't had bad luck with my MMCX cables, is what I was going to say. Metal571, what's going on? Welcome. Don Trumpion saying, I love the look of the Zen. Yeah, I think it is a very, very nice looking IEM. One of the better looking IEMs out there, frankly. Davion Knight, shout out. How's it going? My Life Matters saying, wow, Tesla magnets. All right, someone that knows something about magnets, can you explain to me what is a Tesla magnet? What's the relevance of that? I don't know. I don't know anything about magnets. I'm like the insane clown posse. What's up, Precog? Don Trumpion saying you need a size comparison with the Blessing 2. Let me step aside, reach into my cabinet, and I think I can pull out my Blessing 2. One of these days I should do a tour of my studio, but I did post a photo of it actually on Instagram. If you want to follow me on Instagram, link in the description down below. You can see sort of a behind the scenes photo of this space that I'm in. But for comparison, here is the Moondrop Blessing 2. And you can see, well, I think you're going to see, the Dunu Zen is quite a bit smaller. What do you think? Does that illustrate it well enough? I mean, there's not just sort of this two-dimensional size difference, there is also this girth size difference. The Blessing 2, you can see quite a girthy IEM, while the Dunu Zen is a little bit on the svelte side. Especially for an IEM that's got such a stonking dynamic driver in it. I'm pretty impressed with the packaging that they've done on this thing. Sean saying you might like this IEM, you're gonna try it out. That'd be cool. I think it's definitely worth trying out if it's an option for you. I wish there were more places, at least in the United States, to test out IEMs like this. But it's really hard. You kind of gotta know somebody that has it and try it out there, or just buy it from a retailer that's got good return policy. My Life Matters saying Dunu need to leave some improvement room for the Luna. So I had the Luna on loan from Dunu a couple of months ago, and I haven't listened to it back to back with the Zen. But I think my preference is actually for the Zen. I think the Luna is probably more technical, better mid-range resolution and treble resolution and stuff like that. But the tuning on the Luna, I wasn't the biggest fan of. And while I clearly have said that this is not my favorite tuning, I think this sounds a little bit more natural. And then it's got, again, that physical, that physical character. I think the Luna also did pretty well. But I would say I've enjoyed listening to the Zen more than I enjoyed the Luna. Don asking if the smaller bore tips would bring out the details and treble more. I mean, it's usually the opposite. And in fact, I did some measurements. I was playing around with the tips because I swapped to the Sednas. I was curious to see what the difference between the tips were. And I did, the Sednas versus actually the final E-type tips. And there's a very clear recession, I don't know, say recession, but like it's a couple dB attenuation in the lower treble from the smaller bore finals. Whereas with the Sednas, you get a little bit more of that lower treble. Not a ton, it's not a big difference, but I did find in listening to it that just my initial impression, and this could have been sort of a psychoacoustic thing just in my head, could have been some high-res placebo, but when I listened to the finals, and I only did it for like a song or two, it sounded wrong to me. Metal 571 saying that sounds like an IM version of an XOO. I don't know if I've heard the XOO. Don Trumpion asking, does the Zen have fast bass? I mean, I'll start by saying that I don't have a lot of music tracks in my library that really test the speed, sort of like the speed and the recovery of bass. I listen to a lot of London Grammar, which doesn't have a ton of fast bass, but I would say that the general attack on it is fairly sharp. The decay is not especially fast, so it's got that body to it. I don't know. I would describe it as like moderately fast, but not especially fast. Saw some question about vertical staging. I gotta be honest, when Soundstage definitions or descriptions start getting into vertical versus horizontal, my eyes glaze over a little bit. So I probably am not the best person to ask that question. Axel Deeker saying I'd lean more toward a treble-focused headphones for gaming. Yeah, that seems to be the typical the typical belief is that you want to hear footsteps and directional stuff like that, and having more treble will help. That said, I actually don't like using IMs for gaming. I prefer listening with headphones when I game, which frankly is lately it's almost never. But Guilty Gear Strive, I might get into that one. That one I don't care about the direction of footsteps. Digodoom asking about the Moondrop Aria. I have heard about that. It looks like it's in the same shell as the Starfield and the KXXS, which is interesting. I think the Aria, that's a name that they used before with somewhat budget IM. So I'm wondering if the new Aria is going to come in that same shell as a Starfield, but be even cheaper. I'm kind of curious about it. Although you just said it's going to be priced between the Starfields and the KXXS. That seems like a very narrow place to price your IM, in my opinion. MK is asking me, how do I sleep with IMs without getting tangled up in the cable during the night? I mean, it's going to be a personal thing, right? Different people sleep different ways. I happen to sleep almost entirely on my back, and I don't really move around that much. So I don't know, be chill, which I know people can't control, so that's not a serious suggestion. Yeah, I don't have any issues with IM cables in my sleep. Chris Stroud asking, do they sound better than the Blonde BL03? I mean, it's gonna depend on what you want, to be honest. Like, this is a weird thing about, you know, IMs and prices. Like, I don't think that the Dunu Zen sounds in a way that I'm certain anyone that heard the Blonde would say that the Dunu Zen sounds better. I think the Dunu Zen does some things better than the Blonde. I think the Blonde's a little bit woolly in the bass. It's a little bit warm and a little bit fuzzy, which can cloud up the detail perception of that IM a little bit. But it's not like the Zen is a detail king anyway. But the physical character, again, of the Zen, I think is a thing that I have not heard in another IM, at least not the one that I've got. Maybe the only other IM that I can recall hearing this sort of like physical slam to it was the 64Audio U12T. But I don't know, there might be some people that like the Blonde BL03 better. It's a good sounding IM. It's just a little bit more. It's yeah, it's okay. It's not an IM I love. Metal 571 with a great suggestion. Don't put glue in your hair either. Some people actually do that. Some people actually glue their hair to do like mohawks and stuff, which maybe I'm getting to a point where I can start doing that. What do you think? That'd be a good look? My wife would kill me. Recode asking, is Monarch Godzilla strength? I think when it comes to sub bass, yeah, the Monarch would be Godzilla strength. But the sub bass on the Monarch, you know, as much as like that is overkill bass for me, it still doesn't have the same sort of physical assertiveness of the bass in the Zen, at least in my opinion. Precog saying the BL03 competes more closely with $2,000 IMs. I think that is perfectly sarcastic. Grant is asking, can I compare the Sedna EarFit lights or standard tips to the Zelastec? I mean, I'll compare the Sedna lights, which I have both here on my Blessing 2 as well as on the Zen. These are probably my favorite tips that I've got right now because I like them because they're wide bore. Let's go ahead and punch in on that. I like a wide bore tip. And I was using standard Sednas for a while just because it seemed like I should start with the standards, but I think the material on these things is just a lot better. It grips my ear better, whereas the standard Sednas will tend to, especially as my ear gets a little bit sweaty, will tend to start losing their grip on the inside of my ear. Because of that, I started using the Zelastec tips, which have a ton of grip. You're not going to have any issues with security if you use Elastecs, but they can be a bit of a pain in the butt because they'll like pick up lint. And so I then decided to try the EarFit lights, which is basically sort of in between the grippiness of the stock Sednas and the Elastecs, and this seems to me a better balance. It's still not quite as good as the rubber that Final uses. Final is still, I think, the king of rubber. But the EarFit light is, I think, a pretty decent balance from where I'm at. Oh wow, I just earthquaked my table. King Trank saying, I love the high-res placebo pen. Hey, if you want a high-res placebo pen, there's a link in the description down below to the Super Review merch store. These things are available. Only 10 bucks. Grant saying that would be a great cable if it's sold separately. I'm pretty sure Dunu does sell this cable separately. I know they sell some of their other cables separately. The only downside is they are, in my opinion, stupid expensive. It's like 200 bucks. And there are some of them I think that are even more than that. So I think this is a $200 cable from Dunu. And Grant, thanks for the super chat. Appreciate it. Chris Stroud asking, what is my favorite budget IM? I mean, obviously it's going to depend on what is your budget. But if you want to check out my channel, I have set up playlists for my favorite earphones in different price brackets. And I have a playlist for my top 5 earphones under 50 bucks. My personal favorite, the shortcut is the Moondrop SSR is my personal favorite. Especially if you can EQ down the lower treble just a little bit, like around like 5 or 6K, just drop that by like 3 dB, maybe 4 dB, maybe a little bit more. Just drop it by a little bit and it starts to sound, in my opinion, pretty fantastic. Nandu asking T4 versus Moondrop Starfield. I think I talked about that in my Starfield review if you want more details, but the short of it is I haven't heard either of them in a while. But I would probably, I think I like the T4 tonally better. It's a little bit on the brighter side, a little bit more open sounding. But yeah, I don't know, they're both a little bit lackluster in imaging, which is why I think they both got 4 stars for me. Both very good IEMs, but I would say I probably slightly prefer the T4 sound, but prefer the Starfield's fit. Don Trumpion saying B2 mega chonk compared to Zen. I mean, B2 is mega chonk compared to most things except the Monarch, which is the mega chonkiest of chonks. All right, Megamind, you're saying, you're informing me about Teslas. 1 Tesla equals 10,000 Gauss. Magnemeters, Gauss meters, or pull testers are all used to gauge the strength of a magnet. I think I believe you, but I have no idea. I have zero ability to vet that. And Sean, you're asking about what is fast bass anyway. So typically, when people use the term fast, it's about like, there's sort of like, I see it as like 2 different sort of areas of a bass note, or any note, mid-range, treble, etc., that can be affected by this. But there's sort of the attack of it, sort of the initial hit of the bass, and then there is sort of the decay, or like the sustain of the bass note. When people talk about fast notes, I think they're just talking about how quickly does that happen, and the way that this is going to come across, right? I don't have a timer. I can't measure how quick the bass is. I can't measure how quick the treble is, but when it's not fast, it's notes that are kind of in succession on top of each other are going to start bleeding together, and the definition between them is going to become a little bit muddy and a little bit smeared. Whereas when you have fast notes, the definition between them is going to be very clearly defined and sharp. Having too much definition on bass can sometimes be perceived as a bad thing if there's not enough sustain at the end of the bass note, right? So when you like hit a kick drum, if it doesn't have sort of like a little bit of, you know, that sustained resonance afterward, it can feel a little bit hollow and a little bit less lifelike. I don't know if that's totally answering the question, but when people talk about fast notes, that's kind of how I interpret it. Dylan, are there going to be more headphone reviews? I'm definitely down to review more headphones. What else? What should I review? What's coming up? I'm not too aware of what's coming up in the near future, but I'm definitely open to it. Sergey Marchenko saying to hell with hybrids, 1DD models only. Well, you can go that way if you want. You're just going to be pretty limited. There's not a lot of single dynamic driver IEMs, although I guess you only really need one, right? You don't need new IEMs every week like a reviewer does. I think my personal preference, though, is actually for hybrids, if I'm honest. Chris Strata asking, what are my thoughts on Beryllium drivers? I don't really have any thoughts on Beryllium drivers, to be honest. I kind of don't care what the driver is made out of, because I care about what it sounds like. And I don't have the experience that shows that all Beryllium drivers have the same sound. Like, I've listened to a number of different IEMs and headphones that claim to have some sort of Beryllium integrated into them, and they don't all sound the same. So I can't say that I like Beryllium drivers, and I can't say that I hate Beryllium drivers. I just gotta say that I know some people love Beryllium drivers. My personal take is that it doesn't tell me that much about the way a thing sounds. My Life Matter asking me about, does the sound signature change with burn-in? My opinion is I've never noticed any change in the way an IEM sounds that I would attribute to burn-in. Don Trumpion asking him, am I going to test the ThieAudio Clairvoyance? If I ever get my hands on it, I'm definitely down to try it out, but I don't have it. I don't have one lined up. I don't know when I would hear it. Yeah, Metal. Sorry about the King of Rubber shot. Megamind asking, any new phone reviews coming? I don't know. To be honest, like I kind of lost interest in reviewing phones because they're all just about the same. I do have the iPhone mini. This is what I've been using lately, and I like it quite a bit. I was thinking about doing a review of it, but then I also just kind of got to the point where my review was, it's small and I like it because it's small. And do people want to hear that? I don't know. Shen Shen asking, do I have any plans on revisiting any earbuds? You remember I briefly mentioned the Will Sound Mark II. Yeah, honestly, I just don't know enough about earbuds and which ones out there are worth checking out. I have definitely heard some earbuds that I like. The Will Sound Mark II is a good example of them, but I don't currently have any plans to try out any other earbuds. Oh, Metal with a good comparison of the Starfield and the T4. I'll read what Metal says. I have both the Starfield and the T4. They sort of trade blows. The latter, the T4, is better resolution in mid-range and highs and more slam, but has an annoying 5.5K peak. The Starfield is not as impactful, but less upper mid coloration overall. That sounds about what I would expect you to say. Yeah, the Starfield's a little bit on the warmer side and sort of the upper mid-range and lower treble. So if that's your thing, the Starfield is definitely going to be a little bit easier on the ears. Kai Rhodes saying, I have the Dunu Zen and the SA6 here to test out. I will keep the SA6. I like the sound signature and the universality of this set, but the punch of the Zen is a thing I will have to admit. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way to describe the difference between those two sets. Is the SA6 is just a really nice, natural, neutral all-arounder that's got enough bass presence to make it pretty satisfying. But it doesn't have a hook, right? The hook is just that it's very competent. The Zen, it's got a hook, and that hook is that gorilla strength. And you got to decide which one is more important to you. Wes Miller asking, will I review the Eco OH7? I'm definitely interested to try the OH7, but I don't think I'm getting one anytime soon, so I would not wait for that. Grant, you also got an iPhone mini and you love it. Cool. I think, so this is an interesting thing. Since I decided to not review the iPhone mini, it seems like the iPhone mini is actually the iPhone model that's doing the worst for Apple, which is kind of a bummer, frankly. I don't think it's surprising because, I mean, it took them this long to make this because I think they didn't see that there was a ton of demand for it, but I really love the size of this phone. I don't miss my bigger phone at all. I came from an iPhone XR, which I think is like a 6.3 inch screen, and this is 5. Oh my gosh, I've already forgotten all the numbers, but this is a much smaller screen and a much smaller device. The bigger difference for me, honestly, is not even just the size. I mean, the size matters. but it's the weight of the XR. I couldn't deal with it on my poor little pinky. And the iPhone mini it's kind of ideal for me. Metal571 saying, yeah, it's sad new smartphones were so exciting each year in the early 2010s when you first got into them. Yeah, they were exciting. And like, I feel like I got to the point where you could be using a phone from 3 years ago and you're probably not going to be missing out on much. Like, the battery life might have degraded because that's what happens when you recharge a lithium ion battery for 3 years. But apart from that, like performance-wise, it's probably fine, unless you're playing a lot of, you know, the latest games. But I just almost never play games on my phone, so I don't really care about that. I mean, I want it to be smooth, but most phones, even 3 years ago, are pretty smooth still. Grant asked if I'm planning to review the Qtelix 5K. No, I actually do have a Qtelix here. I got this just to play around with PEQ. And it's pretty fun, but I don't have a ton of use for a Bluetooth dongle like this. So I mostly, I use it for playing around with PEQ, and the Moondrop SSR, I talked about that a little bit earlier. With PEQ, I can get that thing sound really pretty nice. And then I was able to measure it and actually see what the frequency response is based on my changes, which is a lot of fun, but I don't know that that's going to make a great review, to be honest, because I don't use the Bluetooth of it. Yeah. Brandon asking, what's everyone using as a cable replacement to the Moondrop stock cables? I mean, the Moondrop SSR cable, I think, is a fantastic cable. So if you're talking about, like, if you don't like the cable that came on your Moondrop Blessing, well, let's go ahead and punch in here. I'm actually using a non-stock cable on my Blessing. Not because I dislike the stock cable, but just because I like this cable a little bit nicer, or a little bit more. This is a Xiaofan. If you go onto AliExpress and search for Xiaofan, you'll find this. It's not even very expensive, maybe like 35 bucks. But I do also just really like the SSR cable, which if you don't have one of those, you can buy an SSR for 40 bucks, you get a cable, and if you don't like the IMs, well, you spent 40 bucks on a nice cable, which isn't too bad. Laliet, will I review the Unique Melody Mest? I probably won't. I would love to, I just don't see myself getting my hands on the Mest. But I am very interested in it. Zenboy asking, have I heard anything further about the Panda EQ app? No, I have not, and that's a very good question. So for those who might not remember, I reviewed the Drop Panda in January. And when I got that back in December, Drop was telling me that they had a parametric equalizer app that was due out in January or February. And then the last time I talked to them, it sounded like it had gotten pushed out to late February or March. And I haven't heard anything about it since then. Now, we're not in March, so officially it's not late yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it gets pushed back again. Supposedly that's been a thing that's been going on, is it keeps getting pushed back. And Grant with the backup on the Moondrop SSR/SSP cable, saying, yes, my SSP cable is my favorite of all my cables, period. It's a good cable. It's a good cable. Jorge Yvonne asking me to review the Whizzer Kylan HE01. I'm probably not, to be honest. Whizzer's been pinging me on Instagram, asking me about the Kylan HE01, but I don't think I'm gonna have time for it, unfortunately. Kyrode asking, what do I think about balance connections for this IEM? Pretty much the same thing I think about balance connections for everything. I think balanced connections are a waste of time. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of balance. Oh, I mean, it doesn't do anything bad. It just, I think it's a waste of time. I think balance connectors matter less than like 24-bit high-res files. And I think that doesn't, like, that's high-res placebo. I don't care about 24-bit files. I think balanced connectors matter even less. Megamind asking, have I considered doing reviews for non-Chi-Fi IEMs like Sony's Final Audio? I mean, I've done some. I've done some reviews of the Final, with the E2000. I've reviewed the Drop JVC FDX1, Sennheiser IE40. I'm pretty interested in the new Sennheiser with the IE300. Is that right? Is that what it's called? That's a pretty good looking IEM, and I'm pretty interested in that, to be honest. But yeah, I've got nothing against non-Chi-Fi IEMs. It's just that I think there's just more new stuff coming out with Chi-Fi. Like, there's always new stuff. So that's probably why it ends up getting so much coverage. Metal571 saying, buying new headphones just to have a balanced headphone is just why? Yeah, I mean, I get it. Like, people are interested in trying things, right? I think that's what a lot of audio is, honestly, is like, there's some new innovation, whether it's a balanced cable or it's a new type of driver, an IM or something like that. People just want to hear it, and they want to hear it for themselves. And for some people are going to conclude that it's a good thing for them. I think balanced cables is a thing that a lot of people just don't have access to initially when they're getting into audio, and they see it as like this upgrade, this thing that I need to try. And I don't know, maybe you'll get an audio player that has a balanced connector on it, and you'll want to try it out. And it might even sound better on that player, but it's just because that when they made that player, they made the balanced audio output better. There's nothing inherently better about balanced. In fact, that's why I prefer everything to come single-ended, just because it keeps things simple and I don't have to worry about, did the manufacturer put more money and energy into the balanced output versus a single-ended. That's my opinion. All right, it's been a while. I think I'm gonna go ahead and shut down this live stream, but I appreciate you all hanging around and having this conversation, the questions, the thoughts, the opinions, love it all. And if you want to have more of this kind of on an ongoing basis, I do have a Discord server linked in the description down below. Just join it. I'm in there a lot, probably too much, frankly, but if you want to talk about audio, you want to talk about cameras, you want to talk about iPhones, you want to talk about anything, frankly. We talk about some really weird stuff. Join the Discord server. And again, I'm there all week. But if you're not down for that, just, stay subscribed to the channel. If you haven't already, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll see you on the next super review. Cheers.